A little bit of an in-between week for us this week. How's this mic sounding? Is it sounding okay out there? It's just a bit ringy up here, yeah. Come off the back, if you've been here for the last few weeks, of a series that we've been looking at called Formed Together. And next week, we're super privileged to have our friend Dr. Krista McCurland from Kerry Baptist College. She's coming through to speak, and so that's going to be super exciting. And then the week after that, we're into Advent, which is just crazy, right? That means that this week I've defaulted to the lectionary and the gospel reading from there, which is from Mark chapter 13. And I think there is something here, a relevant word for us to be hearing together this morning. And so if you follow along with me, here is the gospel for today. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." "Do you see all these great buildings?" replied Jesus. "Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are all about to be fulfilled?" And Jesus said to them, "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name claiming I am he and will deceive many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places and famines. These are the beginning of birth pains." Let's pray. Lord, as we sit together for a few minutes in your words this morning, as we hear truth that you are communicating to your friends long ago, help us as your friends here this morning to hear your words for us. Help us to hear again what we need to hear in this time and this space, that we might be who you want us to be, and that we would go and do what you want us to do. We ask in your name, Jesus' name, amen. So a little bit of context for this. Where are we? We're in Jerusalem. In Mark's Gospel, this corridor is kind of taking place after the triumphal entry on Palm Sunday into Jerusalem. There's that crazy scene where Jesus goes off into the temple and he's like overturning tables and driving out all of the money changers and the people who are kind of profiting off religion in that space. And then into chapter 11 of Mark, chapter 12 of Mark, Jesus has just been kind of hanging out in the temple area teaching. And here at the start of chapter 13, they head out. And as they go, one of the disciples, as we've read, is kind of marveling at the architecture of what's around them, which, from what we know of it, would have been reasonably understandable. Temple at that time, about 140,000-ish square meters of space, absolutely huge. Stones that were gargantuan in their proportions, some up to kind of 14 meters long, 3.5 meters high, almost 4 meters thick. So we're just thinking about this mammoth kind of effort in engineering, incredibly impressive. And disciples are commenting on it, and Jesus says something which, like, if you'd been there at the time, would have seemed impossible. Take a good look at all of this. It isn't actually going to last. Time is going to come when not a single one of these ginormous stones is going to be left standing on top of the other. It's all just going to be thrown down. And so the scene then fast forwards. They're kind of now sitting out, kind of looking back on the temple, on the Mount of Olives, and some of the kind of inner circle come in for a little bit of a kind of whisper with Jesus. And so he sort of gives them a bit of a prophetic insight into what's going to happen. "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name claiming I am he and will deceive many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, earthquakes in various places and famines, and these are just the beginning of the birth pains. In the lectionary reading for today, that's where it kind of cuts short in verse 8, but it actually keeps on getting wider and bigger as the chapter goes on. And probably what we need to understand to kind of have the key into accessing this passage this morning is that within this and then in the wider remainder of chapter 13, there's two different contexts that are being talked about here. First is Jesus, who's kind of speaking about the immediate context in the world of the disciples and what is going to happen in just a few decades' time. And that is as kind of rebellion against Rome and Judea turns into all-out war, period which culminates in Roman forces actually laying siege to Jerusalem in around 70 AD. And at the orders of Caesar, they break the city and the temple down block by block to the ground, even down to kind of like digging up some of the foundations as this kind of show of power. They leave a couple of towers standing so that people see this mixture of what used to be here and what we did to you. Is kind of the way that it unpacks. Jesus is prophesying here about something that's literally going to happen in the near future when this city is going to be reduced to rubble, and that is what happens. So there's one context, but then if you're to read wider in chapter 13, there's kind of the second context which is going on from the breaking down of the temple. Language takes on sort of tone that we'd find in the book of Revelation. It's sort of like apocalyptic language, and Mark's voice kind of enters into the mix a little bit more, and it becomes clear that from speaking just about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, we've now moved to a wider view of the moment when everything which needs to be broken down will be broken down and then made new at the return of Jesus. So it's kind of like what is going to happen soonish is sort of like the pattern for what will be in the future as well in this text. And I guess, whether it's here in Mark 13 or in maybe like the parallel passages, which are in Matthew 24 or Luke 21, the way that this kind of sometimes gets drawn out, or at least the way that I kind of heard this getting drawn out most of the time, it's sort of like in terms of like doomsday speculation. Sort of run through the passage and kind of go, here's a sort of tick box list of things that need to happen when the end is on its way. Which, it turns out, has actually kind of been a common feature of the Christian religious experience for almost 2,000 years. It's not just today where there are these sort of so-called prophetic voices which are declaring that, the patterns are in place, that everything is kind of aligning for Judgment Day to happen. Kind of speculation that's been going on for centuries in the Christian community. And in fact, ironically, it appears that in part, this is exactly why these words were written, whether for those in the local context in Judea or for us who are part of, the people who pick up these words and live with them here today. It was actually intended that they would achieve the opposite effect among us. As one author puts it, Mark is not seeking to provide a timetable or blueprint for the future so much as to exhort readers to faithful discipleship in the present. But at the same time, it is hard for us when we come to texts like this, because although that speculation might be nothing new in the scheme of things, there's a sense where today it's kind of just amplified 100-fold in this world where, we can literally roll over in bed in the morning and all of it is right here at our fingertips in a very unique way. It hasn't really been the experience of humanity for most of its existence. Here we are, in the last 20 years. This is what we live with. And there's an eeriness, in some of those echoes. Just like in our text today, there are many people with different perspectives claiming to have heard the voice of God and to be speaking on God's behalf. as is mentioned in the text. Nothing has changed. In fact, social media, YouTube, it's kind of made all of that stuff a whole lot worse in our time. We live in a time where wars and rumors of wars, it's there on our screens, but you can literally live stream war from your phone, in the bathroom if you want to. Nations rising against one another, earthquakes and famine. Like we see and we hear this stuff, and it's disquieting, and it rightfully gets to us in this time, in 2024 in Aotearoa where we live. And I guess that's why this morning I just wanted to draw our attention just onto one little word of Jesus that comes in verse 7, and that is to, in the face of these things, to not be alarmed. Do not be alarmed, Jesus says. The root of the word there is describing a state of being troubled, of kind of getting agitated, in ourselves, often in response to like external events or news, things that cause fear and anxiety for us in our world. And if we've been around our Bibles enough, we'll know that the adjacent kind of imperative to not fear is a common feature in Scripture, right? Read through the Bible just over and over and over and over and over again. It's the word to some of the big figures, the Abrahams and the Moses and Joshua and Elijah. It's the word of the prophets to the people of God time and time again, do not fear. We're going to remember very soon. It's the word of an angel paying a visit to a young girl to announce that the hand of God is resting on her. It's the voice of her son speaking over his friends and speaking over us to not fear, to not be alarmed. You hear that over and over again. I guess I'm mindful this morning, though, that this kind of command to not be alarmed, to not fear, more than just meant as something which is, supposed to be like a soothing balm for our souls as we kind of experience the chaos of the world. It's also a word to us which is meant to describe a way of being, a way of living in our world. I was reminded of that in an article that I was reading this week, written by the Anglican Archbishop of Wellington, Justin Duckworth. And he was writing a piece, an opinion piece for the Post, responding to what he calls the GSE, which is his shorthand for the greatest show on earth, which is the US election. And I know I talked about US politics briefly as an example last week. I'm not just a one-track pony, and I'm just stay with me, it's relevant. So Justin Duckworth, in this article, he writes, what I think I've found the most terrifying in the GSE, the greatest show on earth, is the anger and vitriol on display. It's like it has slowly emerged from some primeval space where a monster is in charge and can no longer be tamed. It's sobering to reflect on a political and social system that has reached the point where many find this level of anger acceptable. And then he says, I remember learning after processing a pastoral situation that went particularly badly that anger is actually a secondary emotion. Its primary root is often not a sense of justice and righteousness, but rather fear. This fear tends to take one of three forms: a fear of not having enough, a fear of losing power, or a fear of being overlooked. At the root of much of the behavior we've witnessed across the greatest show on earth is politicians and people who are simply afraid. And so if we want to be people that live to mend the world, and I'm assuming we do, whether we're people of faith or not, it follows that when we notice anger in others, we should be asking, what might they be afraid of? And when we do this, as sure as night follows day, we will end up feeling more compassionate and less defensive, whether that's looking at the greatest show on earth from afar or dealing with the tricky realities of our own lives and relationships. And the equally important question then, as we notice our own anger, is to wonder what we too might be afraid of. And perhaps we might end up with a little more compassion towards ourselves too, which can be no bad thing. Wise word, same. Yeah. Which kind of reminded me that someone else sort of put it a little bit more simply as well. Maybe we'll just keep Justin Duckworth up there though. What he's describing here is that fear has a way of not only being a response to conditions in our world, but actually fear is a key driver of the conditions in our world. The state of fear, the state of being alarmed, it has a way of, turning that amplifier up. And if we are not being careful, if we are not being conscious, if we're not doing the mahi to kind of interrogate ourselves and to examine what is going on in our own hearts, then fear will influence the way that we think, and it will inform the way that we act. And before we know it, we find that we too are part of kind of the swirling mess of chaos that is carrying on in our world as well. And I guess it strikes me that although Justin is writing to the audience of the post, I guess for us specifically as a Christian audience gathered here this morning, not being alarmed, not being fearful. It's not just about how we feel. It's understanding that our responses, they have a key relational in relation to how we are as a church dynamic, and they also have a key kind of missional dynamic to them as well, right? In terms of how we position and posture ourselves in relation to the world around us. Jesus' words here, I think, are just as much an encouragement to these friends of his for what they're about to experience in times to come, as much as for their disposition within it, their kind of their way of being, to not give in to alarm. I think positioning ourselves in this way, not giving into it, it takes away that desire in us for us to be in control. Not giving into alarm, it allows us to see past the perspectives that are very different from our own to the child of God that is there on the other side of them. Not giving into alarm, not giving into fear, it allows us to free ourselves from the vicious cycle of kind of us and them, and that kind of polarizing reality which is the state of our world at the moment, and frees us up to be bridge builders, to find ways to connect rather than wall builders, people who are finding ways to divide, because we are people who live to reflect the unifying love of God. It's always really encouraging, actually, to look back on church history and to see some of the ways in which the early church lived and embodied some of this stuff, because often their context was a lot more difficult. Take, for example, Christian community in Carthage in the 3rd century. This is kind of modern Tunisia, North Africa, part of the Roman Empire at the time. In 251, they come through a period of pretty significant persecution. Caesar had issued an imperial decree across the Roman Empire that every single person within it had to worship the Roman gods and make sacrifices to them. Christians had been torn in this space. Church had been decimated. There'd been groups in the church that had given into this on fear of death. There'd been other Christians who'd been executed as a result of not giving into it. And at this point, an apocalyptic plague breaks out in Carthage in around 251. Just absolutely just horrible conditions: vomiting, diarrhea, fevers, putrefaction. People are dying. People with the plague are just being thrown out into the streets to be left to die. It's just a time of absolute horror, absolute chaos in the world. And within Carthage, a pagan group begins to leverage the hate that had been put against the church in terms of their unwillingness to comply with some of this, these Roman edicts and begin to blame the church for what is carrying on, for their lack of bowing the knee to Caesar and the Roman gods. And it's in this space that Cyprian, who was kind of the foremost bishop in North Africa, leads a response in which he encourages the church to act in a way which is consistent with the words of their faith, which is consistent with the understanding of who their God is, who Jesus is. He encourages them to step into a way of courage, not to respond in this space with fear, though they are dying to the plague just like their neighbors are, but and instead of kind of pushing back on these people who are blaming them for it, instead to begin to extend sacrificial care to their neighbors. He says it would not be at all remarkable if we should only care for our own. Instead, he leads them into loving their enemies and to pray for the salvation of their persecutors as they reach out and care to their community. Building bridges, living out of the opposite of alarm, the opposite of fear. And looking back, there's this marked increase in Christian affiliation in Carthage as the surrounding community sees the response of these Christians to what is going on in the midst of this chaos that they are enduring. And so too today. I mean, we've just been through COVID, a couple of years back. Sort of the same, I suppose. But we live in a world of chaos. We live in a world where there's so much kind of swirling around us at this time. And maybe again here is the opportunity for us to hear these little words of Jesus, to not be alarmed, to not be agitated, to not respond out of fear, both for the sake of ourselves, but also for the sake of everyone around us as well, lest we, in the ignorance to what is actually driving us and our responses, can only contribute further to, the fear and the alarm of our world. And this is really kind of the central perspective to what is the overriding context of chapter 13 of Mark. That though these tumultuous things can happen in life, and they will happen, though our world does appear at times to be a bit of a chaotic mess, what is ultimately true is the hope that in all of this, God is in control. And it comes right near the end of this chapter, in verses 24 and 26. But in those days following that distress, at that time people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Gospel hope, good news hope, is the sense that though things around us, even things that appear to be immovable and unshakable, though we live to see them crumble and fall, still God is in control. That is what gospel hope calls us to. Though fear and anxiety may increase in our world, we are reminded again that this is not the story that we live out of. It's not the story that we're called into as followers of Jesus. Rather, instead, into the way of hopeful certainty, a way in which, though the path may take twists and turns in life, because surely it will, still the end for each of us is certain. In the words of the psalmist, the Lord is with me, and so I will not be afraid. And so may that be our posture, both as individuals, but also as a community, as we navigate these times that we live in here as well. Amen.